The Middle East conflict? Is the international community complicit through inaction? Is the world just watching? Is silence the new form of complicity? As bombs fall and lives are lost in the Middle East, one question screams louder than all others. Is the international community just watching, or are they part of the problem? Today, we're diving deep into a claim that many find uncomfortable and others say is absolutely true. The international community is complicit through inaction. UN, NATO, US, EU, Arab League. If these institutions exist to maintain peace, then why does conflict rage on? Buckle up. This might just change how you see global politics forever. Millions of lives have been altered and ended by conflicts in the Middle East. Israel and Palestine, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq. These aren't isolated crises, they're interconnected flashpoints. And how the world responds shapes global peace, migration, and diplomacy. And yet, despite decades of resolutions, summits, and strongly worded statements, the region is still burning. Some say the international community is powerless. Others argue it's choosing to be. We've heard the headlines. UN expresses concern. NATO condemns violence. EU calls for restraint. But where is the action? Today, we're not just asking if global powers could have done more, we're asking if, by doing less, they're guilty too. Let's start where most discussions end, the so-called guardians of peace. The United Nations was created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But in today's Middle East, many ask, is it doing anything at all? On paper, the UN should be the ultimate peacekeeper. It has peacekeeping forces, humanitarian missions, and global authority. In practice, it's often a gridlocked forum for political theater. Over 45 vetoes have been cast by Permanent Security Council members when it comes to Israel-Palestine alone. Powerful nations like the US or Russia frequently block resolutions that don't align with their geopolitical interests. Peacekeeping forces are either underfunded, undermanned, or not deployed at all in critical conflict zones. One example? In 2018, after violence erupted in Gaza, a UN resolution calling for the protection of Palestinian civilians was vetoed by the US. The result? No action, no change, just paperwork. Critics argue the UN isn't failing. It's designed to fail when global powers disagree. NATO calls itself the world's most powerful defense alliance. With over 30 member nations, cutting-edge military technology, and decades of strategic dominance, NATO has shaped modern warfare and international responses to crises. But when it comes to the Middle East, one pattern emerges loud and clear. NATO acts fast when it suits Western interests and stands back when it doesn't. Let's talk facts. In 2011, when Gaddafi's forces threatened civilians in Libya, NATO launched Operation Unified Protector. Within weeks, no-fly zones were enforced, military strikes were coordinated, the regime was toppled. Quick, decisive, forceful. But compare that to Israel-Palestine, Syria, Yemen. No airstrikes to protect civilians in Gaza, no-fly zones over Syrian skies, no military intervention in Yemen where hundreds of thousands have died. Why? Critics say it's not about justice, it's about strategic value. Libya had oil, Ukraine borders Russia, Iraq had both. But Palestine, Yemen, Syria? The calculus changes. There's no rush to defend democracy when no Western allies are under threat. In 2022, the US and NATO responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with military aid, billions in funding, sanctions, and diplomatic unity. Now compare that to the decades-long occupation in Palestine. NATO offers statements, press releases, symbolic gestures. Some call this hypocrisy. Others call it pragmatic diplomacy. But the message sent is clear. Some lives are worth defending, others are negotiable. Counterpoint. But isn't NATO just a defensive alliance? Let's be fair. NATO wasn't designed to intervene everywhere. It's a collective defense pact built on Article 5 that says an attack on one is an attack on all. And yes, many argue that NATO can't act unless its members are directly threatened. But here's where things get murky. NATO doesn't just act in self-defense. It's intervened proactively in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Libya, not to defend member nations, but to enforce peace and protect civilians. So the precedent exists, the capability exists, but the will? That depends on politics. If NATO can act to prevent genocide in Kosovo, then why not in Gaza? Why not in Yemen, where millions face starvation from a conflict fueled by airstrikes and blockades? The silence becomes a choice. Now let's turn inward to the region itself. With 22 member states, a common language, and shared cultural and religious ties, the Arab League should be the region's strongest unified voice. But when it comes to stopping violence in places like Gaza, Syria, or Yemen, many argue the Arab League is roaring lion in speeches and a whisper in action. Unity or uselessness? Let's start with the original goal: to promote unity among Arab countries, to coordinate political action, to defend Arab interests. Yet today, it's often seen as deeply fragmented, with rival factions working at cross purposes. Think about it. Saudi Arabia and the UAE lead a war in Yemen, a fellow Arab nation. Qatar and Egypt support different factions in Libya. Syria's membership was suspended in 2011 over civil war atrocities. How can the League protect civilians when it can't agree on who the enemy is? In every major crisis, the League has issued emergency meetings, strong condemnations, and calls for peace. But ask yourself, what changed because of them? In Gaza, where over 35,000 plus Palestinians have been killed in the last major escalation, no Arab League country has intervened militarily. In Syria, despite hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, the League watched from the sidelines, paralyzed by internal divisions. In Yemen, member nations themselves are waging war, supplying arms, launching airstrikes, and fueling a humanitarian catastrophe. This isn't just inaction. This is active complicity through division. While Arab leaders debate behind closed doors, it's the ordinary people, the refugees, the families, the children who pay the price. Counterpoint, but can the Arab League really do more? Let's pause for a second. Is the Arab League completely useless? Not entirely. It helped broker ceasefires between Palestinian factions in the past. It created the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, offering Israel full normalization in exchange for a Palestinian state. And it's facilitated humanitarian aid in war zones like Lebanon, Gaza, and Sudan. But here's the catch. These are reactive measures, not preventative solutions. The Arab League has the wealth, influence, and regional proximity to be a decisive actor. But instead, it often waits for Western powers to make the first move. Some say this reflects realpolitik, the art of balancing self-interest over idealism. Others argue it's just cowardice wrapped in diplomacy. And when Arab governments fail to act decisively, their own people begin to lose faith. That's why so many protests across the region aren't just against Israel or the West, they're against their own leaders too. No conversation about global inaction is complete without talking about the two biggest players on the global stage, the US and the European Union. The self-declared defenders of democracy, human rights, and the rules-based international order. But when it comes to the Middle East, one question echoes louder than any diplomatic speech. Are they guided by principles or by power and profit? Let's start with hard numbers. The U.S. provides over $3.8 billion in military aid annually to Israel, the largest military aid package to any country in history. Meanwhile, it also sells weapons to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and Qatar, fueling regional conflicts like Yemen. The EU, too, exports billions in weapons to the same governments, many of which have poor human rights records. So when civilian homes are bombed in Gaza, or schools are struck in Yemen, those bombs often have Western fingerprints on them. That's not just passive inaction, that's active complicity for profit. Supporters say the US and EU are simply protecting their allies. Israel is often referred to as a strategic partner in a volatile region. Saudi Arabia is a counterweight to Iran. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. But that word, ally, has become a shield that deflects accountability, even when international law is violated. For example, the U.S. has vetoed more than 40 UN resolutions criticizing Israel. The EU condemns illegal settlements, but continues to deepen trade ties. Western governments express concern over civilian deaths while approving new weapons deals. Principles sound good on paper, but in practice, realpolitik wins. It's not about justice. It's about who controls the narrative and the battlefield. Counterpoint. What about Western humanitarian efforts? To be fair, it's not all military aid and self-interest. Western nations do provide billions in humanitarian assistance: food aid for Yemen, medical support in Syria, reconstruction funding in Gaza, and they fund NGOs that risk their lives helping victims of war. But here's the catch. Humanitarian aid treats symptoms, not causes. It's like applying a bandage while continuing to supply the bullets. You can't fund peace with one hand and fuel war with the other. And here's what many in the region are beginning to feel: disillusionment, anger, betrayal. The more the West preaches values it doesn't practice, the more it loses moral authority, not just in the Middle East, but globally. It's creating a vacuum, one that's quickly being filled by alternative powers like Russia, China, and Iran. And the longer the West plays both arsonist and firefighter, the more unstable the global order becomes. Let's stop pretending this is just about geopolitics. This is about human lives. Every delay, every veto, every diplomatic shrug comes with a price. Blood, trauma, generations born into war. The international community may not be pulling the trigger, but through silence, arms sales, vetoes, and double standards, it's holding the gun. Let's stop acting surprised when the region rejects Western leadership. Let's stop wondering why new radical ideologies emerge in the shadows of abandoned peace talks. The truth is, silence is not neutral. Silence becomes policy, and inaction over time becomes a form of participation. The UN can't keep hiding behind procedures. NATO can't selectively enforce protection. The US and EU can't sell arms by day and offer condolences by night. And the Arab League must decide whether it wants to be a symbol or a force. Because here's the uncomfortable reality no one wants to face. If we keep watching and doing nothing, we are no longer observers. We are accomplices. We've laid out the case. Some will agree, others will argue back. And that's exactly the point, because this isn't a lecture, it's a debate. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to challenge how you think. So now, the mic passes to you. Do you believe the international community is truly complicit through inaction? Or are these just the limits of a messy, imperfect system doing its best? Are the UN, NATO, the Arab League, the US, and the EU failing morally, or acting pragmatically? Drop your thoughts below. Be bold, be respectful, be sharp. Because this conversation matters, and it's time the world stopped whispering about injustice and started debating it. Subscribe for more mind-opening debates. Question everything. Debate everything. See you in the next one.